Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into a corner of the Five Nights at Freddy's universe that exists in the shadows, away from Scott Cawthon's official releases and Steel Wool's polished productions. A corner where creativity and obsession collide, where passion projects sometimes spiral into something far darker than anyone intended. This is the story of FNAF fan games that crossed lines nobody should have crossed. Games that revealed uncomfortable truths about creative freedom, community boundaries, and the thin line between tribute and transgression. Born from a passionate fandom that emerged alongside Scott's original game in 2014, the fan game community started as something beautiful. Creators who loved the mechanics, the atmosphere, the storytelling potential of animatronic horror began crafting their own interpretations. Some were clever parodies. Others were earnest attempts to expand the lore. Many were simply love letters to a franchise that had captured imaginations worldwide. But among thousands of projects uploaded to platforms like GameJolt and itch.io, some took disturbing turns. Some revealed their creators' darkest impulses, and some should never have existed at all. From games that sexualized characters meant to terrify children, to projects that became vehicles for disturbing content their creators later weaponized, to officially endorsed titles that imploded spectacularly due to creator misconduct, we'll trace the complete evolution of how a vibrant creative community had to reckon with its own dark corners. Whether you're discovering these cautionary tales for the first time, letting familiar controversies pull you deeper into understanding, or simply allowing this exploration to wash over you like an unsettling reminder of how quickly passion can curdle into something toxic, this will carry you through the full, uncomfortable history of FNAF fan games that cross the line. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you appreciate this kind of deep, thoughtful examination of gaming controversies that most would rather forget. And let me know in the comments if you remember any of these incidents firsthand, or if you're encountering these stories for the first time. It's always fascinating to see how different generations of FNAF fans process these uncomfortable chapters of the fandom's history. Let's begin. The Golden Age. When fan games meant something pure. In the quiet haze of 2014 and 2015, something remarkable was happening on GameJolt. Scott Cawthon's original Five Nights at Freddy's had struck a nerve with independent game developers, bedroom programmers, and creative teenagers alike. The game's deceptively simple mechanics masked sophisticated horror design. Its minimalist graphics hid maximum atmospheric tension, and its cryptic lore invited endless speculation and reinterpretation. Within months of the first game's release, fan projects began appearing. Not just a handful, not just dozens. Hundreds upon hundreds of Five Nights at Freddy's inspired games flooded the platform with such volume and velocity that GameJolt's administrators had to create an entirely new category just for FNAF content. And this wasn't typical fan game behavior. Most franchises inspire scattered tribute projects, a few dozen at most spread across years. But FNAF was different. The franchise's mechanics were accessible enough that someone with basic click team fusion knowledge could create a functional game, yet deep enough that experienced developers could craft genuinely innovative experiences. The lore was open enough for interpretation that creators felt empowered to tell their own stories within the universe's framework. And crucially, Scott himself seemed to tacit approve, with no documented cases of him issuing takedown notices or threatening legal action against fan creators during this period. This silent blessing opened floodgates of creativity. early fan games ranged wildly in quality and ambition. Some were barely modified clones of the original, swapping Freddy for different characters but keeping identical mechanics. Others reimagined the formula entirely. Five Nights at Candy's, created by Emil Mako, introduced new animatronics with distinct personalities and behaviors that felt like natural extensions of Scott's original vision. One Night at Flumpty's, developed by Jonachrome, took the concept in surreal directions with its egg-shaped antagonist, who could transcend space and time. The Joy of Creation series by Nixon pushed FNAF into free-roaming horror, abandoning the security camera format entirely to create something that felt fresh while honoring its inspiration. These games weren't just technically competent. Many demonstrated genuine artistic vision, exploring themes Scott's games only hinted at. They experimented with narrative structures, gameplay mechanics, and atmospheric techniques. Some focused on building elaborate backstories for original characters. Others created entire mythologies parallel to, but distinct from Scott's lore. The best of them felt like they could have been official FNAF titles, carefully crafted experiences that understood what made the franchise work, while adding their own voice to the conversation. The community that formed around these projects was remarkably supportive. YouTubers like Markiplier and Darko would play fan games alongside official releases, giving amateur developers audiences of millions. GameJolt's comment sections buzzed with constructive feedback, encouragement, and genuine excitement for each new project. Developers collaborated, sharing assets and techniques. The phrase FNAF fan game became a genre unto itself, and with understood conventions and expectations that evolved alongside the official franchise. This golden age peaked around 2015 and 2016. By then, GameJolt hosted over 200 FNAF fan games, with more appearing daily. Some developers achieved near-celebrity status within the community, their projects eagerly anticipated and dissected like official Scott Cawthon releases. The line between fan creation and professional game development began blurring. Several fan developers were building portfolios that would launch actual careers in the industry. The ecosystem felt healthy, vibrant, self-sustaining. But even during this golden period, warning signs flickered at the edges. Not every creator approached fan game development with pure intentions. Not every project deserved the platform it received, and the very openness that made this creative explosion possible, the lack of gatekeeping or quality control, meant that anyone could upload anything regardless of content or creator character. The same democratization that enabled talented teenagers to share brilliant projects also allowed disturbed individuals to use FNAF as a vehicle for something far darker. Platform administrators at GameJolt mostly operated hands-off. Their content guidelines prohibited explicit sexual content, graphic violence beyond standard horror game levels, and copyright infringement, but enforcement was reactive rather than proactive. Games stayed up until someone reported them, and even then, removal wasn't guaranteed. This worked fine when most projects were earnest attempts at horror game design. But as the fan game community grew, it attracted attention from people whose motivations weren't about honoring Scott's work or crafting engaging experiences. Some saw the FNAF brand as an easy way to generate attention. Others had more disturbing agendas, and a few were simply too young, too inexperienced, or too troubled to understand that creative freedom came with responsibilities. The first cracks in this golden age appeared not with a single catastrophic failure, but with a gradual realization. As more fan games appeared, quality control became impossible. Anyone could claim their hastily assembled project was a serious contribution to FNAF culture. Developers who invested months crafting polished experiences found their work buried under mountains of low-effort content. And occasionally, something would surface that made everyone uncomfortable, and that crossed boundaries nobody had explicitly defined but everyone somehow recognized. These early instances were usually ignored, written off as one-offs, aberrations that didn't reflect the community as a whole. But patterns were forming. Certain types of projects kept appearing despite community disapproval. Certain creators kept pushing boundaries to see what they could get away with. And the platforms hosting these games found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position, caught between supporting creative freedom and protecting their users from content that clearly violated the spirit, if not the letter, of their guidelines. The question nobody wanted to ask, but everyone was starting to think about was simple. Where exactly is the line? At what point does a FNAF fan game stop being a tribute and become something else entirely? Something that shouldn't exist? The answer to that question would come in stages, through a series of controversies that forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, through games that started as passion projects but revealed their creators' disturbing obsessions, through officially endorsed projects that imploded spectacularly when creator misconduct came to light, through platform battles about what content was appropriate for a franchise built around horror aimed at teenagers, and through the slow, painful realization that creative freedom without responsibility isn't freedom at all. It's just chaos wearing a more appealing mask. These controversies would reshape the fan game landscape entirely. They would lead to stricter platform guidelines, community self-policing, and eventually Scott Cawthon's own attempt to curate and elevate quality projects through the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. But they would also leave scars, cautionary tales whispered about in forum threads and video essays, games scrubbed from archives but never fully forgotten. Because once something exists on the internet, once it captures even a moment of attention, it becomes part of the historical record, whether anyone wants it to be or not. When dreams turn dark, the first warning signs. The transition from golden age to troubled times didn't happen overnight. It crept in gradually, like mold spreading behind wallpaper, invisible until suddenly everywhere. The first warning signs came from unexpected directions, in small incidents that seemed isolated but formed a pattern once you knew what to look for. Understanding how the FNAF fan game community went from celebration to controversy requires examining these early moments when enthusiasm began curdling into obsession, when creative freedom started being weaponized, when the absence of boundaries revealed itself as a dangerous vulnerability rather than a liberating feature. One of the earliest red flags appeared not in a game itself, but in creator behavior. Young developers, some barely teenagers, were receiving massive attention for their projects, thousands of downloads, comments from famous YouTubers, feature spots on GameJolt's front page. This attention was intoxicating, especially for people who had never experienced any kind of recognition before. Most handled it gracefully, staying humble and focusing on improving their craft. But others let it go to their heads. They began treating their fan projects like major commercial releases, issuing dramatic statements about delays, attacking critics, cultivating parasocial relationships with their small but devoted fan bases. This toxic celebrity culture created ecosystems where developer misconduct could flourish. Fans would defend their favorite creators no matter what, treating criticism of a game as personal attacks on themselves. Developers learned they could behave poorly and face minimal consequences as long as they kept producing content their audience wanted. The line between creator and fan began dissolving in unhealthy ways, with some developers viewing their audience as personal armies to deploy against anyone who disagreed with them. And this dynamic would prove catastrophic later when serious allegations emerged against certain creators, as their cultivated fan bases initially refused to believe anything negative about their heroes. Platform moderation struggled to keep pace. GameJolt and itch.io operated with small teams focused more on technical infrastructure than content curation. Their guidelines were written for a pre-FNAF internet, where fan games were niche, obscure, unlikely to generate significant controversy. Nobody had anticipated that a survival horror franchise about haunted animatronics would spawn thousands of derivative works, some of which would push boundaries in disturbing ways. The platforms operated reactively, taking down content only after multiple reports, by which point the damage was often done. Our educational institutions began noticing problems too. Teachers reported that FNAF had become an obsession among middle and high school students, dominating conversations and classroom projects. Some students were creating fan games as school assignments, which seemed harmless enough until educators realized they had no way to verify what content these games contained. Several school districts blocked GameJolt entirely on their networks after discovering students were accessing horror content during class time. This led to broader conversations about age-appropriate content in the FNAF community, conversations that revealed how many young children were engaging with material meant for teenagers or adults. The Scratch platform became ground zero for these tensions. Scratch, developed by MIT as an educational programming tool for children, had a thriving FNAF fan game scene. Young kids, some as young as 8 or 9, were creating rudimentary FNAF games using Scratch's block-based coding system. This would have been wonderful, evidence of FNAF inspiring young people to learn programming, except for two problems. First, many of these games attempted to recreate the jump scares and horror elements from Scott's games, which was inappropriate for Scratch's intended age range. Second, older kids and teenagers were uploading much more sophisticated and genuinely frightening FNAF games to Scratch, where younger children could easily access them. Scratch's moderation team tried to thread an impossible needle. They couldn't ban FNAF content entirely, as thousands of users were engaging with it, but they also couldn't allow horror content on a platform designed for elementary school students. Their attempted compromise, allowing FNAF-themed projects but prohibiting anything scary or violent, satisfied nobody. Young creators felt censored and misunderstood. Parents and educators felt Scratch wasn't protecting children adequately, and the moderation team found themselves in an endless game of whack-a-mole, taking down inappropriate projects only to see new ones appear immediately. This Scratch situation revealed a fundamental tension within the FNAF fan game community. Scott Cawthon's games were rated for teenagers, intended for an audience mature enough to handle horror themes. But the franchise's cute animatronics and viral appeal had attracted a much younger demographic, and children who loved the characters but weren't ready for the actual horror content. Fan games existed in this murky space between children's content and teenage horror, and different creators had wildly different ideas about where their work should fall on that spectrum. Some made genuinely child-friendly FNAF games with no scary elements. Others created experiences darker and more disturbing than anything in Scott's official games, then uploaded them to platforms children could easily access. The lack of age verification on GameJolt and itch.io compounded this problem. Anyone could create an account and download any game regardless of maturity rating. Parent controls were minimal to non-existent. This meant that disturbing content could reach audiences it was never intended for, with no gatekeeping mechanism to prevent it. And as we'll see, some creators exploited this intentionally, using the FNAF brand to expose young audiences to inappropriate material under the guise of fan projects. Content warnings became a heated debate. Should fan game creators include explicit warnings about mature content? What counted as mature in the context of a horror game franchise? Was it the creator's responsibility to anticipate who might play their game? Or was it the player's responsibility to make appropriate choices? Different creators had different answers, and the platforms provided little guidance. Most fan games included no content warnings beyond their titles. Someone downloading Five Nights at Something knew generally what to expect, but beyond that baseline, anything could be waiting in the download. Money entered the equation too, and while most fan games were free, some creators started accepting donations through Patreon or offering early access to paid supporters. This transformed hobby projects into revenue streams, which changed the entire dynamic. Now creators had financial incentives to generate attention by any means necessary. Controversial content became a marketing strategy. Pushing boundaries wasn't just about artistic expression. It was about standing out in an increasingly crowded field, about generating the buzz that translated to Patreon subscribers. This commercialization of fan content created ethical questions nobody had good answers to. Was it legal to profit from FNAF fan games? Did Scott Cawthon have legal recourse if he objected? Should platforms allow monetization of derivative works? The answers remain murky, and in that murkiness, increasingly questionable projects found room to flourish. Copycat behavior accelerated problems. When one controversial game generated attention, other creators noticed and thought, I could do that too. Each boundary crossed made the next boundary easier to cross. Each time a problematic project stayed up on GameJolt, despite reports, it signaled to creators that standards were loose, enforcement was lax, and they could probably get away with pushing things even further. This created a race to the bottom where attention-seeking creators kept escalating, each trying to be more shocking, more controversial, more extreme than the last. The community's response was fragmented. Some fans argued for complete creative freedom, insisting that censoring fan games was wrong regardless of content. Others pushed for stricter standards and active moderation. Many were simply confused, unsure where they stood on these issues, recognizing problems, but hesitant to advocate for solutions that might stifle legitimate creativity. This lack of consensus meant that problematic creators could always find defenders, people who would argue that criticism of their work was censorship, that calling out misconduct was harassment, that any attempt to establish community standards was authoritarian overreach. Forum discussions became increasingly heated. Threads about content standards devolved into shouting matches. People who raised concerns about inappropriate content were accused of being uptight, of not understanding artistic freedom, of trying to ruin the community. Meanwhile, people defending controversial games were accused of enabling abuse, of prioritizing edgy content over safety, of not caring about younger fans who might encounter disturbing material. The middle ground eroded, replaced by increasingly polarized camps that couldn't find common language to discuss these issues productively. Looking back, it's clear that the FNAF fan game community was heading toward a reckoning. The early warning signs pointed to a system that couldn't sustain itself, where the absence of meaningful standards and accountability was creating conditions for serious problems. But at the time, these warning signs were easy to dismiss. Each incident could be framed as an isolated case. Each controversy could be blamed on individual bad actors rather than systemic issues. The community wanted to believe that everything was fine and that these were just growing pains, that the golden age could continue indefinitely if everyone just relaxed and stopped making such a big deal about every little thing. They were wrong. The real controversies, the ones that would force everyone to confront these issues head-on, were just beginning, and they would involve games and creators whose behavior was so problematic, whose content was so disturbing, that even the most ardent defenders of creative freedom would have to admit that some lines should never be crossed, that some fan games should never have existed, that the community needed to fundamentally rethink how it approached these issues if it wanted to survive with any integrity intact. Our 5 Nights in Anime, the first major line crossed. The first FNAF fan game to generate widespread controversy beyond niche community circles appeared in early 2015, just months after Scott Cawthon's original game revolutionized indie horror. Created by a developer known as Mirusu Power, 5 Nights in Anime reimagined Scott's frightening animatronics as anime-style female characters wearing minimal clothing. The game's premise was simple. You're a night guard at an anime convention, and the convention's animatronic performers want to play with you in ways that become increasingly suggestive as the nights progress. When these characters catch you, rather than the standard FNAF jump scare death, they suffocate you with their bodies in sequences that were clearly meant to be sexually provocative rather than frightening. The game's existence forced the FNAF community to confront an uncomfortable question. Where exactly is the line between fan creation and inappropriate content? On one level, 5 Nights in Anime was clearly parody, an intentionally absurd reimagining that took the franchise's horror elements and replaced them with fan service. Mirusu wasn't hiding what the game was about. The title made it explicit. The promotional images left nothing to imagination. Anyone downloading it knew exactly what they were getting. From this perspective, 5 Nights in Anime was just another corner of FNAF fan content, no different from the countless other creative reinterpretations flooding GameJolt daily. But on another level, the game represented something troubling. FNAF was a franchise whose core audience skewed young, with many fans in middle school or early high school. Scott Cawthon's games, while horror-themed, contained no sexual content whatsoever. They were about survival, fear, mystery, atmosphere. 5 Nights in Anime took characters from a franchise popular with teenagers and sexualized them in ways that felt exploitative, particularly given that the animatronics in Scott's games were possessed by dead children. The game's entire premise relied on taking horror elements intended to frighten and repurposing them for sexual titillation, creating a weird hybrid that felt wrong to many community members. The game's mechanics were lifted almost entirely from the original FNAF, with only cosmetic changes. You monitored cameras, conserved power, closed doors to block characters. The twist was that when you failed, instead of a shrieking jump scare followed by a game over screen, you got a drawn-out sequence of a character in revealing clothing performing suggestive actions. The game tracked which characters had caught you, turning deaths into a collection mechanic that appeared designed to encourage players to lose on purpose to unlock all the sequences. This approach seemed to transform FNAF's survival horror into something closer to a dating sim or fan service collector, representing a fundamental departure from what made the franchise work. Community reaction split sharply along predictable lines. Younger fans and those who valued FNAF's horror integrity were disgusted, viewing Five Nights in Anime as a perversion of what they loved about the franchise. They argued the game disrespected Scott Cawthon's work and made the community look bad to outsiders, and normalized sexualizing a franchise built around dead children's souls trapped in robots. They called for Game Jolt to remove it, for the community to collectively reject it, for Myrusu to take it down voluntarily out of respect for the franchise and its younger fans. But another faction defended the game vigorously. They argued it was obvious parody, that Myrusu had every right to create whatever FNAF content he wanted, that people offended by it were being prudish and oversensitive. They pointed out that anime fan service was a legitimate genre with millions of fans worldwide, that combining it with FNAF was creative rather than offensive. They insisted that if people didn't like Five Nights in Anime, they simply shouldn't play it, that the game's existence didn't harm anyone because nobody was being forced to download it. And they accused critics of trying to censor art, of not understanding internet culture, of being uptight about content that was meant to be light-hearted fun rather than serious horror. This debate raged across Game Jolt comments, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and Twitter exchanges. Neither side could understand the other's perspective. To critics, defenders were either naive about how content spread online or willfully ignoring how sexualized content featuring characters from a franchise popular with minors created serious problems. To defenders, critics were overreacting to harmless parody, trying to impose their personal moral standards on everyone else, exhibiting the exact kind of puritanical gatekeeping that stifled creativity. The gulf between these positions was unbridgeable, because they started from fundamentally incompatible premises about what FNAF fan games should be allowed to do. Game Jolt initially left Five Nights in Anime up. The game didn't violate their content guidelines as written. It contained no explicit nudity, no actual sexual acts, nothing that clearly crossed into pornographic territory. The characters wore revealing clothing, but not less than you'd see in many mainstream anime. The death sequences were suggestive but stopped short of anything explicitly sexual. Myrusu had been careful to toe the line between provocative and prohibited, creating something that made many people uncomfortable, but that technically complied with platform rules. Taking the game down would have required Game Jolt to adopt stricter, more subjective content standards, a move they were reluctant to make. The game's popularity complicated the situation. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, Five Nights in Anime received tens of thousands of downloads. It showed up in YouTube playthroughs, some treating it as a joke, others playing it straight, a few offering serious critical analysis of its construction and themes. The attention generated by controversy drove more downloads, which generated more attention, creating a feedback loop. Myrusu became a known figure in the community, for better or worse. He followed up Five Nights in Anime with a sequel that expanded the concept, adding more characters, more mechanics, more content in the same vein. The games found an audience that apparently wanted this hybridization of FNAF and fan service, regardless of how it made other community members feel. But the game's real impact wasn't measured in downloads or attention. Five Nights in Anime's significance came from what it revealed about the FNAF fan game community's inability to self-regulate. Here was a project that many people found objectionable, that arguably violated the spirit of what FNAF was about, that potentially exposed younger fans to inappropriate content, and the community couldn't do anything about it. Platform guidelines were too vague. Community consensus didn't exist. Creator rights to interpret FNAF however they wanted clashed with audience desires to maintain some standards about what counted as acceptable fan content. Five Nights in Anime exposed all these tensions without resolving any of them. The game also set a precedent. If sexualized FNAF content was allowed, what else would be permitted? If Game Jolt wouldn't take down something that generated this much controversy, what would actually violate their standards? Other creators noticed. Some began working on their own provocative projects, reasoning that if Myrusu could get away with this, they could push boundaries too. The floodgates didn't exactly open, but they cracked. The message seemed clear. FNAF fan games could be about anything, and as long as they technically complied with platform rules, nobody would stop you. Myrusu himself seemed largely unbothered by the controversy. In 2021, he posted an April Fool's joke claiming Five Nights in Anime would join the Fazbear Fanverse initiative, Scott Cawthon's official endorsement program for quality fan games, and the joke revealed how aware Myrusu was of his game's controversial status. The massive gap between what Five Nights in Anime represented and what Scott would actually approve. He knew his game would never get official blessing. That was part of its identity, part of its appeal to his audience. It existed in explicit opposition to what official FNAF represented, and Myrusu wore that opposition as a badge of honor. Five Nights in Anime accomplished what it set out to do, prove that FNAF could be reimagined in any direction, that community disapproval wasn't enough to stop problematic projects, that controversy could be leveraged into attention and downloads. The game existed now in YouTube archives, fan wikis, and download mirrors. It couldn't be erased, only referenced as the first major example of a FNAF fan game that crossed a line, and that made people question whether the community needed firmer boundaries, even if nobody could agree where those boundaries should be drawn. Looking back, Five Nights in Anime seems almost quaint compared to later controversies. The game was provocative rather than genuinely harmful. Myrusu was seeking attention rather than trying to hurt anyone. The content was inappropriate for younger fans, but not explicitly dangerous. It represented poor judgment and poor taste rather than actual malice. But it was the first domino, the first project that showed how FNAF's open creative culture could be exploited, how platform guidelines weren't prepared for the specific issues that arose with massive fan game communities, how controversy could be profitable rather than something to avoid. Everything that came after, and all the worst controversies and more serious problems, happened in a landscape that Five Nights in Anime helped create. FNAF+, when official endorsement goes wrong. In 2021, Scott Cawthon announced something unprecedented, the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. After years of fan games existing in legal grey areas, Scott was officially endorsing selected projects, offering developers funding, resources, and legitimacy. It was a revolutionary move, one that recognized the talent within the community and attempted to elevate the best fan content to professional status. 5 remarkable projects were chosen: Pop Goes, Candies, One Night at Flumpty's, The Joy of Creation, and 5 Nights at Freddy's Plus. This last selection generated particular excitement because, unlike the others, FNAF Plus was a direct reimagining of Scott's original game rather than an original story set in the FNAF universe. 5 Nights at Freddy's Plus came from Phil Morg, known online as Fisnom, a 24-year-old Chilean animator and game developer who had built a reputation for creative, slightly edgy content. His vision for FNAF Plus was compelling. Take Scott's original game and rebuild it with modern graphics, redesigned animatronics that looked properly unsettling, and quality of life improvements while staying faithful to the classic spirit. Early teasers showed animatronics that looked genuinely terrifying in the ways Scott's original models couldn't achieve with 2014 technology. The project seemed poised to become the definitive way to experience the first FNAF game, a loving remake that honored the original while bringing it to contemporary standards. Fisnom's inclusion in the Fazbear fanverse gave him access to resources most fan developers could only dream about. Official backing from Scott meant money for development, permission to eventually sell the game commercially, and the kind of legitimacy that transformed hobby projects into real career opportunities. He had a Steam page, a trailer, regular development updates, a growing fan base eagerly anticipating the game's release. Everything was going perfectly, until July of 2023, when it all collapsed in less than a week. The trouble started with the release of FNAF Security Breach, Ruin, a DLC expansion for Steel Wool Studios' latest official FNAF game. Fisnom live-streamed himself playing through Ruin on July 29th, and his reaction was less than enthusiastic. He criticized various aspects of the DLC, questioned design choices, and ended his stream with a tweet that simply read, "Well, that was boring." This wasn't particularly unusual. Creators criticize other creators' work all the time. Game developers have opinions about games, sometimes negative ones. The tweet generated some disagreement, but nothing serious. Just another voice in the ongoing conversation about Security Breach's divisive reception. But then something unexpected happened. A Twitter user known as Alex, with the handle G0LD3NR4BB1T, quoted Fisnom's boring tweet and jokingly replied, "Can we tweet this after FNAF Plus comes out? It's only fair." It was meant as a light-hearted jab, a playful way of saying, if you're going to criticize other people's work publicly, and be prepared to receive similar criticism yourself. Most people would have laughed it off, maybe fired back with their own joke, and moved on. Fisnom did not respond that way, and more importantly, his fan base did not respond that way. Within hours, Alex was receiving death threats, dozens of them. People were sending explicit gore images, videos of real violence, content so disturbing that Alex, who was reported by multiple community members to be a minor, felt genuinely unsafe. The harassment was coordinated and intense, with Fisnom's fans apparently viewing Alex's mild joke as a personal attack on their favorite creator that demanded extreme retaliation. This kind of parasocial fandom behavior, where fans treat any criticism of a creator as an attack on themselves, had been building in gaming communities for years, but this was particularly vicious, particularly sustained, and targeted at a minor for making a joke that barely qualified as criticism. The appropriate response from Fisnom would have been immediate and unambiguous. Condemn the harassment, tell his fans this behavior was unacceptable, defend Alex, and make clear that sending death threats and gore over a video game opinion was psychotic overreaction. Instead, Fisnom responded with sarcasm. He tweeted, "That's pretty messed up. Why can't I get death threats? Do other people deserve death threats and I don't? Every real Fisnom trademark fan knows that I'm the only one that should be getting death threats. Could I get some death threats now, please? Give them. Please give Delic death treats." The tweet was meant as a joke, an attempt to diffuse tension with humor, but it landed catastrophically. Hard to critics, Fisnum was making light of serious harassment his fans had directed at a minor. He was treating death threats as something to joke about rather than condemn. He was implicitly validating his fans' behavior by not shutting it down immediately and forcefully. When people called him out for this response, asking why he wasn't defending Alex or telling his fans to stop, Fisnum doubled down. He posted what he claimed was an apology document, a Google Doc link that people clicked expecting contrition and accountability. Instead, the link redirected to a Rickroll, the ancient internet meme of tricking people into watching Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. This was when community opinion turned decisively against Fisnum. The Rickroll apology convinced people that he either didn't understand the severity of what was happening or didn't care. A minor had received genuine death threats and gore because of Fisnum's fan base, and he was treating it as a big joke, an opportunity for internet pranks rather than a moment demanding serious response and accountability. Hashtags started trending, hashtag FirePhilMorgue and hashtag cancel FNAF Plus from Fanverse. Community members emailed Scott Cawthon directly, explaining the situation and demanding Fisnom's removal from the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. The subreddit exploded with criticism. YouTube videos dissecting Fisnom's behavior racked up hundreds of thousands of views. Only after this massive backlash did Fisnom post what seemed like a genuine response. He tweeted that sending death threats and gore was completely inexcusable, and that he obviously don't support this at all. He promised to block and ban anyone who engaged in the harassment if people would report them to him. This should have been his first response, posted hours earlier. Instead, it came after a full day of controversy, after trending hashtags, after damage that couldn't be undone. And even this belated condemnation felt insufficient to many critics, who noted that Fisnom was positioning himself as a victim of rogue fans, rather than acknowledging his role in cultivating the kind of fan base that would react this way to mild criticism of his work. On August 2nd, just 4 days after the initial incident, something changed on FNAF Plus's Steam page. Fisnom's name disappeared from the developer listing, and he was also banned from the game's discussion forums. The page had been scrubbed of his direct involvement, though the game itself remained listed. Speculation immediately erupted. Had Scott fired him? Had Fisnom stepped down voluntarily? Was the game still happening without him? Nobody from official channels said anything, leaving the community to piece together what had happened from contextual clues and deleted tweets. On August 4th, Fisnom finally addressed the situation directly in a video posted to his YouTube channel. He confirmed that he had been terminated from the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. He explained his perspective on the controversy, admitted he had handled things badly, and announced he was leaving the FNAF community entirely. The video was emotional, surprisingly vulnerable, with Fisnom acknowledging that his initial responses were mistakes and expressing regret for how everything had spiraled. Many viewers found the video genuine and powerful. Others felt it was too little too late, that Fisnom was only showing accountability after losing everything, that if the consequences had been less severe, he would have continued making jokes rather than taking responsibility. The day after Fisnom's video, FNAF Plus's Steam page was removed from public view entirely. All YouTube videos about the game were made private. Social media posts were deleted. The game was being scrubbed from the internet, or at least from official channels. This confirmed what many suspected. FNAF Plus wasn't just changing developers, it was being cancelled outright. Too much of the game's identity was tied to Fisnom's vision, and too much controversy surrounded it now. and Scott, who had carefully curated the Fazbear fanverse to represent the community's best, couldn't allow a project associated with this scandal to carry his official endorsement. Over a year later, in November of 2024, FNAF Plus was officially confirmed as permanently cancelled. The game's SteamDB page, a database that tracks all Steam entries even after removal, updated with a retired status. This ended any lingering hope that the project might somehow continue without Fisnum. Five Nights at Freddy's Plus would never be released. All the work, all the anticipation, all the potential for this to become a definitive way to experience the original FNAF. Everything was gone. The game became a cautionary tale instead of a playable reality. Remembered not for its impressive graphics or faithful reimagining, but for being the first Fazbear fanverse title to implode due to creator misconduct. The FNAF Plus situation revealed several uncomfortable truths about the community. First, it showed how parasocial fan relationships could turn toxic, how creators who cultivated devoted audiences sometimes inadvertently created attack dogs who would harass anyone perceived as criticizing their favorite developer. Fisnom's fans didn't send death threats because he told them to. They did it because they felt such personal investment in him and his work that a joke about his game felt like a personal attack they needed to defend against. This dynamic existed throughout gaming communities, but rarely got this much attention or had such severe consequences. Second, and it demonstrated that official endorsement from Scott Cawthon didn't protect developers from accountability. Being part of the Fazbear fanverse wasn't a shield against consequences for bad behavior. If anything, it raised the bar for conduct because Scott's reputation was now attached to these projects. A random fan game could be controversial and survive. A fanverse game had to maintain standards because it represented not just the developer, but Scott himself and everything the FNAF brand had built. Fisnom discovered this the hard way, learning that being officially endorsed meant you couldn't treat serious harassment as a joke without losing that endorsement immediately. Third, the controversy exposed how communities struggled to separate art from artist. Many people who had been excited for FNAF Plus found themselves conflicted after Fisnom's removal. The game looked genuinely impressive in trailers. The animatronic designs were creative. By most accounts, what had been built so far was high quality. But could you separate that from Fisnom's behavior? Should people continue supporting the project if he wasn't involved? Did wanting the game to release somehow validate his actions? These questions had no easy answers, and the community split into camps based on their personal conclusions. The entire incident took less than a week, July 29th to August 4th. 6 days during which a promising project endorsed by FNAF's creator transformed into a scandal that ended careers and killed a game thousands of people had been eagerly anticipating. Looking back, and what's striking is how avoidable this was. If Fisnom had responded appropriately when harassment started, if he had condemned death threats immediately instead of making jokes, if he had understood that cultivating a fan base came with responsibility for their behavior, if any of those things had happened differently, FNAF Plus would probably exist today. Instead, it stands as the most prominent example of how creator misconduct can destroy projects regardless of their quality or official backing. How fans' actions reflect on creators even when not directly encouraged, and how quickly everything can collapse when serious issues get treated as opportunities for internet pranks, rather than moments demanding accountability and care. Adomitabis, the game that should never have existed. If Five Nights in anime crossed lines of taste and appropriateness, and FNAF Plus imploded due to creator misconduct during development, Dormitabis represents something far more disturbing. A fan game whose content and creator were both so problematic that even discussing it feels uncomfortable. This is the story of how a FNAF fan project became a vehicle for genuinely disturbing themes, created by someone whose real-world behavior proved even more troubling than anything in the game, and how the community had to reckon with having celebrated a project that, in retrospect, should have raised red flags from the beginning. Dormitabis first appeared in development around 2016, created by a German developer known as Blackout, whose real name was later revealed to be Justin Nicholas Kannenberg. From the start, the project positioned itself as darker and edgier than typical FNAF fan games. While Scott Cawthon's games hinted at dark themes, child murders, and possessed animatronics haunted by trauma, they presented these elements with restraint. Horror came from implication, from what you didn't see, from details hidden in newspaper clippings and 8-bit minigames. Dormitabis took the opposite approach, dragging dark themes into explicit focus, making them central to its narrative rather than atmospheric background. The game's story centered on a character named Garvey Wright, positioned as a sort of alternate universe William Afton, the franchise's canonical villain. But where Afton's motivations and methods were kept deliberately vague in Scott's games, Dormitabis spelled everything out in disturbing detail through audio tapes you collected while surviving nights in a decayed restaurant. These tapes revealed Garvey as explicitly evil, describing murders in graphic terms, detailing violence against named victims, and including themes that went far beyond what any FNAF game, official or fan-made, had ever attempted. Most controversially, Dormitabis included explicit references to rape. One character's backstory involved being sexually assaulted before being murdered, with this trauma presented as part of her reason for becoming a vengeful spirit. The game didn't portray this for cheap shock value in a single line of dialogue. It was woven throughout the narrative, discussed in multiple tapes, treated as a key component of the story Blackout wanted to tell. But this represented a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate subversion of what FNAF horror was supposed to be about. Scott's games worked because they implied terrible things happening to children without showing graphic details. They let your imagination fill in blanks. Dormitabis did the opposite, explicitly narrating dark content that FNAF fans argued should never have been associated with the franchise. Beyond the rape theme, Dormitabis was just aggressively bleak. Characters were murdered in cruel ways. The restaurant setting felt more like a torture chamber than the melancholic abandoned pizzeria of FNAF 3. Animatronic designs were grotesque beyond functional horror design, aiming for disgusting rather than frightening. Audio tapes included Garvey discussing his crimes with a level of detail that felt like the developer was more interested in dwelling on atrocity than creating engaging horror. Where Scott's games made you dread what might be lurking in the shadows, Dormitabis made you uncomfortable in ways that felt exploitative rather than scary. The game's visual design was criticized even by people willing to overlook the content concerns. Dormitabis combined FNAF 3's texture style with bizarre aesthetic choices that made everything look cheap and unpleasant. Character models used repetitive textures that created a Roblox-like appearance despite being a ClickTeam Fusion project. The office environment was cluttered and unclear. Multiple reviewers described it as one of the ugliest FNAF fan games ever created, which was saying something given how many low-effort projects existed. The visual ugliness wasn't stylistic horror design. It was just poor execution that made playing the game actively unpleasant. Technically, Dormitabes was plagued with issues. The game frequently crashed, particularly during boss fights. Mechanics were poorly explained. Difficulty spiked randomly. Audio balancing was terrible, with some sounds barely audible, while others were painfully loud. Despite being in development for over a year before its 2018 release, the game felt half-finished, like Blackout had prioritized getting his disturbing narrative into the world over creating a functional horror experience. This raised questions about what the game was actually for. The evidence suggests it may have been meant, primarily, as a vehicle for Blackout to express his dark themes under the cover of being a FNAF fan game, rather than as a traditional horror experience designed for player enjoyment. Despite, or perhaps because of, its controversial content, Dormitabes gained significant attention. Popular YouTubers played it, often expressing discomfort with the rape elements but continuing through the game for content. The controversy generated views, and views generated more players, which generated more controversy in a familiar feedback loop. For a while, Dormitabes occupied a strange position in the community, widely recognized, frequently discussed, but with a general sense that something about it felt wrong, even if people couldn't quite articulate what. The game existed in the community's collective awareness as this dark, uncomfortable thing that was technically impressive enough to warrant attention, but ethically questionable enough that celebrating it felt inappropriate. Then, around 2020, the situation escalated significantly. While an initial expose video had circulated as early as 2018 before being removed, it was in 2020 that comprehensive allegations emerged with full documentation. These details, compiled by multiple sources and later confirmed by Nocturnum, developer of Five Nights at Treasure Island, revealed that Blackout had allegedly engaged in inappropriate conversations with a minor, specifically a 12-year-old. The details that emerged painted a disturbing picture, and Blackout had allegedly used his status as a recognized FNAF fan game developer to build relationships with young fans, then leveraged those relationships in inappropriate ways. The conversations that were exposed contained content that went well beyond what could be explained as poor judgment. They showed predatory behavior, deliberate grooming tactics, exploitation of power dynamics between a known creator and a vulnerable fan. When confronted with these allegations, Blackout didn't fight them. He went completely silent, disappearing from all social media platforms, effectively confirming through his absence what the allegations had claimed. The community reacted with horror and betrayal. People who had played Dormitabes, who had featured it in videos, who had discussed its story and mechanics, and suddenly felt complicit in something terrible. The game's dark themes, particularly the sexual violence elements, took on new and sinister meaning in light of allegations against its creator. Questions emerged about whether Dormitabes had been Blackout working through his own disturbing thoughts, whether the game represented a red flag everyone missed. Looking back, several community members noted they had always felt uncomfortable with Dormitabes' fixation on explicit descriptions of violence against young people, but they had dismissed those concerns as overreaction to edgy horror content. In retrospect, those concerns felt prescient. Game Jolt took down Dormitabes, though by then the damage was done, and the game existed in countless archives and download mirrors. The FNAF community immediately moved to distance itself from Blackout. His name became synonymous with the worst kind of creator misconduct. Other developers who had worked with him rushed to condemn his actions and explain they had known nothing about his behavior. Nocturnum, who had exposed Blackout and ensured he wouldn't be involved in Five Nights at Treasure Island's final version, was widely praised for protecting the community, though he noted the decision to investigate came after he noticed disturbing patterns in Blackout's online behavior that others had apparently ignored. The question of what to do with Dormitabis itself became complicated. The game existed. People had downloaded it. Videos about it were online. Should the community treat it like it never happened? Should videos be deleted and discussion forbidden? Or should Dormitabis be discussed specifically as a cautionary tale about how warning signs can be missed when controversial content gets dismissed as just edgy creative choices? Different people reached different conclusions, but there was general agreement that Dormitabis could never be celebrated or recommended the way other fan games were, that its existence had permanently tainted it regardless of any technical or gameplay merits it might have possessed. In 2023, a remastered version of Dormitabis appeared, developed by a different team called Expelled Studios with permission from Onetric, someone who had worked on the original game but wasn't Blackout. In this remaster, attempted to salvage what might have been an interesting FNAF fan game concept while removing Blackout's involvement and toning down the most problematic content. The rape elements were removed entirely. The story was rewritten to be dark without being exploitative. Character designs were improved. Technical issues were fixed. The goal was creating a version of Dormitabis that could exist without the shadow of its creator's actions and original content choices. The remaster's reception was mixed. Some people appreciated the effort to reclaim something from the wreckage, to show that a project's dark history didn't have to completely define it if other creators were willing to rebuild it properly. Others felt that Dormitabis was too tainted, that no amount of rewriting or redesign could separate the game from its origins, and that trying to preserve it in any form was misguided. And some simply felt exhausted by the entire situation, tired of Dormitabis consuming community energy and attention when everyone would be better off moving on completely. But moving on required learning the lessons Dormitabis taught, and those lessons were uncomfortable ones. The community had to acknowledge that it had, for years, celebrated a game whose content should have raised concerns earlier. The explicit violence, the sexual assault themes, the dwelling on graphic details of harm to young people, all of this was there from the beginning. People had noticed and felt uncomfortable, but those concerns were dismissed as pearl clutching, as not understanding horror, as trying to censor creative expression. When someone said, "This feels wrong" about Dormitabis, and they were told they were being too sensitive, that horror games were supposed to make you uncomfortable, that content warnings were for babies, and while the game stayed up and maintained its place in community consciousness, its creator was allegedly using his status to harm real people. This revealed a fundamental problem with how the FNAF fan game community approached troubling content. There was an assumption that creative choices existed in a vacuum, that you could separate the art from the artist, that a game's themes had nothing to do with the person who created it. Dormitabis suggested this assumption might be dangerously naive. When someone creates content fixated on violence against children, when they dwell on sexual assault of minors in unnecessary graphic detail, and when they fill their creative work with themes of exploitation and trauma, the pattern could be worth examining more closely. While not every creator of dark content has concerning behavior, the Dormitabis case raised questions about whether such fixations might sometimes serve as warning signs rather than just edgy horror choices. The Dormitabis situation also showed how platforms' reactive moderation approaches failed to protect users. The game stayed up on GameJolt for years despite reports about its content, because it technically didn't violate guidelines written before anyone imagined FNAF fan games would include explicit discussions of sexual violence. Only after Blackout's behavior came to light did the platform act decisively. This meant the game had years to find audiences, and including young people who definitely shouldn't have been exposed to its content before anything was done. And even then, removal from official platforms didn't erase Dormitabis from existence, just pushed it further into the shadows where oversight was even less possible. The voice actors who had contributed to Dormitabis faced uncomfortable positions too. The Sparky 556, who voiced Garvey Wright and delivered all those disturbing tape dialogues, publicly stated he regretted his involvement. He hated the character, hated being associated with the game, wished he had never agreed to participate. For him and other contributors, working on Dormitabis had seemed like a normal fan game gig, a chance to be part of something ambitious. None of them knew about Blackout's personal behavior, and none of them realized how the game's content would be perceived in retrospect. They were left trying to distance themselves from something they had helped create in good faith, their work now permanently associated with one of the community's worst controversies. Looking at Dormitabis years later, what's striking is how the warning signs were present from the start but dismissed. Not the revelation about Blackout's behavior, which required investigation and courage from people like Nocturnum, who noticed concerning patterns, but the game's acceptance despite its content, the way uncomfortable themes were rationalized away as artistic expression, the assumption that explicit violence and sexual assault belonged in a FNAF fan game just because the creator insisted they were important to his vision. A community with clearer boundaries and with greater willingness to say this crosses a line, even when the creator defended their choices, might have rejected Dormitabis much earlier, though whether this would have prevented real-world harm remains an open question. Dormitabis stands as the darkest chapter in FNAF fan game history, not because it was technically terrible, though it was, not because it made questionable creative choices, though it did, but because it represented what happens when a community fails to establish and enforce reasonable standards about content appropriateness. When red flags get ignored because acknowledging them would require uncomfortable conversations about boundaries. When the desire to appear open-minded and supportive of creative freedom overrides legitimate concerns about disturbing content and potentially disturbing creators, and the game shouldn't have existed. Not in the form Blackout created, and the fact that it did, that it found an audience and maintained community presence for years, that people defended it against criticism, using arguments about artistic freedom and not censoring horror. All of that represents a collective failure that the community is still reckoning with today. The Scratch platform wars, when kids get caught in the crossfire. While Game Jolt dealt with disturbing content from troubled developers, another platform was fighting its own battle over FNAF fan games from a completely different angle. Scratch, the visual programming platform developed by MIT to teach children as young as 8 how to code, found itself unexpectedly hosting thousands of FNAF fan projects. These range from crude recreations of Scott's games, to original stories, to dress-up games featuring the franchise's characters. And Scratch's moderation team, which had created guidelines for a children's educational platform, had no idea how to handle a massive influx of horror game content that technically broke their rules, but had become such a dominant part of their community that banning it outright seemed impossible. The tension emerged gradually. Scratch had always allowed users to create games inspired by popular media. Kids made Pokemon projects, Minecraft animations, Undertale fan games. But FNAF presented unique challenges. Unlike those other franchises, horror was FNAF's entire point. The jump scares, the tension, the fear of animatronics hunting you through dark corridors, these elements defined the franchise. But they also violated Scratch's community guidelines, which explicitly stated that content should be appropriate for all ages and that projects should not be too distressful, since Scratch was an all-ages website. A faithful FNAF recreation on Scratch was inherently against the rules. But FNAF was so popular that by 2015, searching the platform returned hundreds of projects tagged with the franchise. Scratch's initial approach was inconsistent. Some FNAF games stayed up while others were removed. The apparent standard was subjective. If something seemed too scary, it got taken down. But what counted as too scary varied depending on which moderator reviewed a project and what their personal tolerance for horror content was. And this created an environment where young developers never knew if their FNAF project would be allowed or removed, which felt arbitrary and frustrating. Scratch's guidelines said projects should be appropriate for all ages. But FNAF itself was rated for teenagers. How could you create an age-appropriate version of a franchise built on jump-scare horror? Some young developers got creative. They made FNAF projects without jump scares, substituting the death animations with characters giving death stares, or simply displaying text saying "Game Over." They created FNAF-themed dress-up games, which stayed close to the characters without including horror elements. They made FNAF-inspired story projects that used the setting and animatronics, but focused on narrative rather than fear. These projects existed in an approved grey area, FNAF content that technically complied with Scratch guidelines by removing everything that made FNAF scary. They satisfied neither horror game fans, who found them boring, nor moderators concerned about any FNAF presence on a children's platform. In November of 2015, Scratch made a more formal announcement. They weren't banning FNAF content entirely, but they were implementing restrictions. Direct recreations of FNAF gameplay were no longer allowed. Projects with jump scares, described as screamers, were banned across the board. Content involving violence, even implied violence, would be removed. What was permitted? FNAF characters in non-horror contexts, discussions of FNAF in forums, fan art. But essentially, you couldn't make an actual FNAF game on Scratch anymore. You could reference the franchise, but not recreate what made it popular. This announcement caused massive backlash from Scratch's young user base. Forum threads exploded with complaints. Kids who had spent weeks or months developing FNAF projects watched them get taken down. Some users threatened to leave Scratch entirely, viewing the restrictions as censorship. Others accused moderators of not understanding FNAF, of being too sensitive, of ruining what had become a major part of Scratch culture. A few started campaigns to bring back FNAF, creating protest projects and forum posts demanding Scratch reverse its decision. The controversy became one of Scratch's most significant moderation challenges, with "Please bring back FNAF" threads accumulating hundreds of comments before being closed by tired moderators. But Scratch's position was complicated by factors young users didn't fully appreciate. The platform had received complaints from parents about children accessing horror content. Some school districts had blocked Scratch on their network specifically because students were playing FNAF games during class. The negative attention threatened Scratch's educational mission and relationships with schools. From MIT's perspective, they couldn't allow their platform, designed to teach programming to children, to become known as a place where kids played horror games. The educational value wasn't worth the reputation cost or the liability concerns that came with young children accessing content designed to frighten teenagers. Scratch also implemented a search filter. Typing FNAF, or Five Nights at Freddy's, into the search bar returned no results, even though a FNAF project still existed on the platform. This was meant to prevent young children from accidentally discovering horror content while browsing for games. But it frustrated creators whose FNAF-compliant projects became essentially invisible. If people couldn't search for your game, how would they find it? The only way to discover Scratch FNAF projects became through Google searches that led directly to specific project pages, bypassing Scratch's internal search entirely. This created a weird situation where FNAF content technically existed on Scratch but was hidden from most users, existing in a kind of platform limbo. The controversy revealed tensions about who Scratch was really for. Young developers who had learned programming specifically to create FNAF games felt betrayed, and they argued that teaching kids to code was the goal, and if FNAF motivated them to learn, Scratch should support that regardless of the franchise's horror elements. But Scratch's creators maintained their platform was for elementary and middle school students learning programming fundamentals, and that horror content was inappropriate for that age group, even if it motivated some learners. Both sides had valid points, but they couldn't be reconciled. Either Scratch allowed FNAF content and dealt with concerned parents and schools, or they restricted it and alienated a significant portion of their user base. International users added another complication. Kids in different countries had wildly different cultural attitudes toward horror content. What American moderators considered inappropriate might be perfectly acceptable elsewhere. Scratch was a global platform, but its rules reflected American educational standards and liability concerns. This meant international users sometimes found their projects removed for violating cultural standards that didn't match their own context. A 12-year-old in Europe might be allowed to play FNAF at home, but couldn't create FNAF content on Scratch because American platforms had stricter age appropriateness standards. The Scratch situation also highlighted how FNAF had become a gateway franchise for young gamers and developers. For many kids in the mid-20-teens, FNAF was their first horror game, their first experience with indie gaming, their first attempt at creating game content. The franchise's relatively simple mechanics and clear visual style made it accessible to beginners in a way that more complex games weren't. But this meant the FNAF community skewed younger than horror gaming normally did, with many fans who weren't emotionally ready for actual horror content, but loved the characters and concept. Scratch captured this demographic perfectly. Kids too young for FNAF's intended audience, but old enough to be fascinated by it. Some Scratch users found workarounds that technically complied with guidelines while maintaining FNAF elements. They created FNAF-inspired original characters, animatronics that looked suspiciously similar to Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica, but had different names and slight design modifications. They made games in the style of FNAF, without using franchise terms, calling their projects things like Five Nights at Original Names. They uploaded games claiming to be comedy parodies rather than horror recreations, and framing jump scares as jokes rather than genuine frightening elements. Scratch moderators found themselves in endless arguments with clever kids who had technically complied with rules, while obviously violating their spirit. The platform eventually settled into an uneasy equilibrium. FNAF content wasn't explicitly banned, but it was heavily restricted and frequently removed. most young developers moved to other platforms like GameJolt, or gave up on FNAF projects entirely. Scratch's forum still saw occasional debates about whether the restrictions were fair, but the passionate community outcry gradually faded as kids aged out of Scratch or found other interests. The controversy became a historical footnote, a cautionary tale about what happens when a massively popular franchise designed for teenagers becomes beloved by children too young for its actual content. Looking back, the Scratch situation differed fundamentally from controversies like Dormitabes or FNAF Plus. There were no allegations of creator misconduct, no disturbing content beyond age-inappropriate horror elements. The conflict was purely about platform rules versus user desires, about who should decide what content was appropriate for whom. But it revealed the same basic tension that ran through all FNAF fan game controversies. Creative freedom versus community standards. Individual expression versus collective responsibility. And the question of where to draw lines when passionate people disagree about whether lines should exist at all. The kids caught in this crossfire largely weren't doing anything wrong. They loved FNAF. They wanted to learn programming by recreating games they enjoyed. They didn't understand why adults kept telling them their favorite franchise was inappropriate for them when they were already playing the official games. From their perspective, Scratch's restrictions seemed like adults not understanding youth culture, not recognizing that kids could handle more than adults gave them credit for. But from Scratch's perspective, they had a responsibility to maintain an educational platform appropriate for their youngest users, even if that disappointed older kids who wanted more creative freedom. This tension between protecting younger audiences and supporting older creators never got fully resolved on Scratch, but it forced conversations about age-appropriate content that the broader FNAF fan game community had been avoiding. If 8-year-olds shouldn't play FNAF, but 12-year-olds reasonably could, what about 10-year-olds? What about a mature 13-year-old versus an immature 15-year-old? At what point does parental judgment supersede platform rules? And if platforms can't enforce age restrictions, should they default to the strictest standards to protect their youngest users? These questions had no easy answers, but Scratch's experience with FNAF forced the community to at least acknowledge they existed, rather than assuming everyone could self-regulate appropriately. The cascade. Other controversies that shaped the community. While Five Nights in Anime, FNAF+, and Dormitabes represented the most prominent and thoroughly documented controversies in FNAF fan game history, they weren't isolated incidents. The community faced a cascade of smaller but still significant problems that collectively shaped how fan game creators, players, and platform moderators thought about boundaries, accountability, and community standards. Understanding the full picture requires examining these additional controversies, each revealing different facets of how creative freedom without appropriate oversight can enable problematic behavior. Jonachrome, creator of the beloved One Night at Flumpty series, saw his reputation severely damaged in November 2021. A twit-longer post published by a former partner accused Jonachrome of being in a relationship with them when they were 13 years old, and he was 20. The allegations described a pattern of manipulation and inappropriate behavior that lasted for years. Jonachrome initially attempted to defend himself, but as more details emerged and other people corroborated the timeline, his position became untenable. The situation was particularly devastating because One Night at Flumpty's had been one of the most creative and universally beloved fan games, known for its surreal humor and clever subversion of FNAF tropes. It had earned a spot in the Fazbear Fanverse initiative based on its quality and Jonochrome's apparent talent. Now that endorsement felt tainted by the creator's alleged behavior with a minor. Unlike Fisnum's situation where backlash came from how he responded to harassment, Jonochrome's controversy involved direct allegations of serious misconduct. The community response was swift. People who had celebrated one night at Flumpty's found themselves in uncomfortable positions, wondering if they should delete videos about the games, if recommending them now somehow endorsed Jonochrome's alleged behavior, if the art could truly be separated from the artist. Scott Cawthon never publicly commented on Jonochrome's status in the Fazbear fanverse, but the practical effect was the same as Fisnum's explicit removal. Jonochrome disappeared from the community, his reputation destroyed, his future projects dead on arrival. One Night at Flumpty's remained playable, but forever associated with controversy. And the pair Discord scandal in 2022 revealed coordinated misconduct by multiple fan game developers. Ramonov, Mechless, and Ultranite, creators behind JR's, Project Readjusted, and Chompers respectively, were discovered to be part of a private Discord server called The Pair. This group existed specifically to collect and share personal information about FNAF community members, including Scott Cawthon himself. They planned to blackmail victims and leak sensitive information anonymously. They collected details on unreleased fan games and titles from other indie franchises like Choo Choo Charles, intending to spoil them maliciously. What made the Pair scandal particularly disturbing was the calculated nature of the misconduct. These weren't impulsive bad decisions or problematic creative choices, and this was organized conspiracy to harm people within the community for no clear benefit. The group's plans included rigging GameJolt's system by mass downvoting competitors' games while boosting their own projects using alt accounts. They made homophobic, sexist, and transphobic comments about Scott's wife and various fanverse members. The intent seemed to be creating chaos and asserting power within the community through intimidation and information control. When the pair's activities were exposed, GameJolt and the official subreddit took immediate action against the offenders. The developers were banned from platforms. Their projects were removed from consideration for any official recognition. Chompers, which had been in development specifically hoping for Fazbear fanverse inclusion, was cancelled entirely. Shortly after the scandal, Scott suspended all future applications to the fanverse indefinitely. The program wouldn't accept new projects because the vetting process had clearly failed to catch multiple developers engaged in coordinated misconduct. This had ripple effects throughout the community, closing a pathway to official recognition that many legitimate developers had been working toward. Squimpus McGrimpus, creator of the immensely popular FNAF VHS series, faced grooming allegations in March 2023. The VHS series had revolutionized FNAF fan content by presenting the lore through found footage and analog horror aesthetics, creating some of the most effective FNAF-adjacent horror content ever made. Squimpus's work was widely regarded as among the best fan-made FNAF content ever produced, and capturing the franchise's unsettling atmosphere in ways even the official game sometimes struggled with. The allegations described inappropriate behavior with an underage user in their Discord server, patterns that mirrored other creator misconduct cases. Squimpus released a statement admitting to the behavior and offering apologies before becoming inactive online. Friends and collaborators cut ties. The VHS series, while technically still viewable on YouTube, became another example of brilliant fan work forever tainted by its creators' actions. The pattern emerging across these controversies was troubling. Almost every case involved creators in positions of minor celebrity within the FNAF community, developers or content creators who had built devoted fan bases, using that status inappropriately with younger fans, and the dynamic was eerily consistent. Creator builds a reputation through quality fan work, attracts devoted young audience, uses that audience's trust and admiration in exploitative ways, eventually gets exposed when victims speak out. This suggested the problem wasn't isolated bad actors, but a systemic issue with how fan communities enabled problematic creator-fan relationships, particularly when many community members were minors and many creators were only slightly older, existing in that dangerous zone where they had power and recognition without emotional maturity or oversight. Female developers face unique harassment that male developers largely didn't. Purity Sinners became infamous for her work on the third edition of Five Nights at Treasure Island, after she removed photo-negative Mickey and attempting to sever the game's connections to the abandoned by Disney creepypasta it was originally based on. She claimed Slimebeast, the pasta's creator, was responsible for wanting the character removed. Slimebeast immediately called her out and disproved her claims. The controversy revealed Purity Sinners had a pattern of misrepresenting her role in projects and making false accusations against other developers. She was not invited back for Treasure Island's final edition, but the harassment she received went beyond appropriate criticism of her behavior. She received rape threats, doxing attempts, and sustained campaigns to drive her from the community entirely. Other female developers reported similar experiences, noting that male developers who made mistakes got criticism, while female developers who made mistakes got targeted harassment campaigns aimed at destroying them personally. The troll game phenomenon created its own problems. Some developers created intentionally terrible FNAF games as jokes, uploading them to GameJolt with descriptions mocking the franchise and its fans. These range from harmless parodies to mean-spirited attacks on the community. Some troll games contain flashing lights designed to trigger seizures. Others included loud audio designed to damage headphones or hearing. A few contained malware or viruses. Platforms struggled to distinguish between earnest but low-quality projects from inexperienced developers versus deliberately harmful content disguised as games. The volume of uploads made manual review impractical, but automated systems couldn't catch subtle problems. This meant malicious content sometimes stayed up for days or weeks before being reported and removed. Copyright issues emerged periodically, though less frequently than might be expected. Scott Cawthon's general permissiveness toward fan games meant he rarely issued takedowns. But when fan games used copyrighted music from other sources, or when they borrowed too heavily from other franchises, legal problems occasionally surfaced. The Jolly series, created by Ivan G., was based on the real Filipino fast food chain Jollibee. When Scott considered it for the Fazbear fanverse, other developers alerted him to the copyright issues. Using real company characters and branding, even in a horror parody context, created potential legal liability, and the series was quietly dropped from fanverse consideration. This revealed how fan games existed in complex legal territory, acceptable as FNAF tributes, but potentially problematic when incorporating other copyrighted material. Remake culture created tensions too. When fan developers offered to remake other fan games with better graphics or improved mechanics, it wasn't always welcome. Original creators sometimes felt their work was being disrespected or stolen. Conflicts arose over whether remake developers should ask permission, what counted as transformative work versus just theft, and who had rights to concepts that weren't copyrighted but were distinctive. These disputes usually stayed within the community and resolved through conversation. But they revealed how even well-intentioned tribute culture could become contentious when creative egos clashed. The most insidious problem was subtle: the normalization of pushing boundaries. Each controversy that didn't result in serious consequences for creators sent a signal that bad behavior was acceptable. When Five Nights in Anime stayed up despite criticism, other creators learned sexual content was permitted. When developers with known problematic behavior continued getting community support, it suggested accountability was optional. When platforms only took action after massive public pressure, it incentivized creators to push boundaries until they hit that pressure threshold, then pull back just enough to avoid consequences. And this created an environment where the question wasn't, is this appropriate, but is this bad enough that I'll actually face consequences? Collectively, these controversies taught the FNAF fan game community painful lessons about needing better standards, better moderation, and better community norms. But they also revealed how resistant communities can be to implementing those improvements. Every attempt to establish clearer boundaries was met with accusations of censorship. Every call for better accountability was dismissed as cancel culture. Every suggestion that some creative choices were inappropriate faced pushback from defenders of absolute creative freedom. The community was caught between recognizing it had serious problems and being unwilling to accept solutions that might limit what creators could do or say. Scott's gatekeeping attempt, the Fazbear Fanverse Initiative. In 2020, Scott Cawthon made an announcement that transformed the FNAF fan game landscape. The Fazbear Fanverse Initiative. After years of fan games existing in legal grey areas, with talented developers working for free on passion projects that generated no revenue despite their quality, Scott was officially endorsing selected titles. The chosen games would receive funding, professional support, and permission to sell commercially on Steam. It was unprecedented for a major gaming franchise to formally embrace fan content this way, giving amateur developers official blessing and business opportunities typically reserved for licensed contractors. The initiative represented Scott's vision for how to cultivate fan creativity while maintaining quality standards, and an attempt to elevate the best fan content to professional status while implicitly filtering out the problematic projects that had been plaguing the community. The initial wave included 5 projects: Pop Goes by Kane Carter, Five Nights at Candy's by Emil Mako, One Night at Flumpty's by Jonachrome, The Joy of Creation by Nixon, and FNAF Plus by Fisnum. Each represented different approaches to FNAF fan game design. Pop Goes had intricate lore and unique mechanics. Candy's refined the classic formula with new characters. Flumpty's took surreal, subversive approaches. Joy of Creation pioneered free-roaming FNAF horror. Plus promised a faithful remake of the original game. Together, they showcased the franchise's creative breadth, while maintaining quality standards Scott felt comfortable putting his name behind. But the fanverse also defined boundaries through what it excluded. Kane Carter, creator of Pop Goes, later revealed conversations where Scott explained certain content was incompatible with official FNAF. Mature themes like excessive violence, explicit sexuality, drug references, and vulgar language weren't acceptable for fanverse consideration. This wasn't about legal restrictions but brand management. Scott had built FNAF as horror content appropriate for teenagers. Fanverse projects needed to respect that positioning. They could be scary, dark, atmospheric, but they couldn't cross into adult content territory that would associate FNAF with themes Scott wanted the franchise distant from. This exclusion criteria immediately disqualified projects like Five Nights in Anime, whose entire premise centered on sexualizing franchise characters. Hamarusu's April Fool's joke about FNAF in anime joining the fanverse revealed his awareness that his work stood opposite everything the initiative represented. Similarly, games with excessive gore, projects built around shock value rather than atmosphere, and any content prioritizing edginess over actual horror design were implicitly rejected by fanverse standards. Scott was drawing a line, saying these interpretations of FNAF, while legally permissible as fan content, didn't deserve official recognition or endorsement. The vetting process for fanverse inclusion remained opaque. Scott never published detailed criteria for what made projects eligible. From examining accepted titles, the standards appeared to be professional level quality, original creative vision within FNAF framework, appropriate content for teenage audiences, and developers, without concerning public behavior or controversial histories. This last criterion became increasingly important as creator misconduct controversies emerged. Being talented wasn't enough. Developers needed to represent themselves and the franchise appropriately, maintaining reputations that wouldn't embarrass Scott or taint the FNAF brand by association. Several projects that seemed fanverse ready were quietly passed over. Ivan G's Jolly series, as mentioned earlier, faced copyright issues with Jollibee that made official endorsement legally complicated. Even though the games were well made and popular, using real-world company assets created liability Scott wanted to avoid. Afton Built, pitched specifically for fanverse consideration as an original concept, was declined for undisclosed reasons, and the developer never received detailed feedback about why the project didn't fit Scott's vision, which frustrated creators who invested significant effort, specifically hoping for fanverse inclusion, without clear understanding of what would actually qualify. The initiative's announcement generated mixed reactions. Chosen developers were ecstatic, thrilled to see years of passion project work validated and given commercial viability. Fans of selected games celebrated seeing quality fan content elevated to official status. But developers whose equally polished projects weren't chosen felt confused and disappointed. The community debated what made chosen games special beyond quality, wondering if personal relationships with Scott, timing of development cycles, or other factors beyond pure merit influenced selection. Some argued the fanverse created unfair two-tier systems, where blessed projects got resources and recognition, while equally worthy games remained amateur efforts. The exclusion of horror-focused mature content particularly frustrated certain developers who felt FNAF's core was its horror edge. That taming fan content to match Scott's brand management concerns diluted what made FNAF compelling. They argued the franchise's success came from not pulling punches with horror elements, from being genuinely unsettling rather than safely spooky. Restricting fanverse projects to teenager-appropriate content meant excluding fan games that pushed horror boundaries in ways Scott himself had sometimes done, and this debate revealed fundamental disagreement about whether FNAF was horror that happened to appeal to teenagers or teenager content that incorporated horror elements, with implications for what fan interpretations were considered legitimate. The fanverse's evolution over time revealed its challenges. When Fisnom was removed from FNAF Plus following his controversy, The game effectively left the initiative, even though it wasn't formally cancelled until much later. This showed that fanverse inclusion was conditional, that developer behavior could disqualify otherwise acceptable projects. When Jonochrome's allegations emerged, One Night at Flumpty's remained technically in the fanverse, but in practice became an embarrassment Scott couldn't explicitly address without drawing more attention to the situation. And the initiative that was supposed to celebrate community creativity became entangled in controversies about creator misconduct that overshadowed the games themselves. The pair Discord scandal's exposure led to Scott suspending future fanverse applications indefinitely. The vetting process had failed to catch multiple developers engaged in coordinated malicious behavior. If people who seemed like respectable community members were secretly planning to dox Scott and his family, blackmail community members, and rig game Jolt's system, how could he trust future applicants? The administrative burden of properly vetting developers, investigating their histories, and monitoring their ongoing behavior proved more complex than anticipated. Suspending applications was admission that the initiative structure wasn't sustainable in its current form. Critics noted the fanverse essentially functioned as gatekeeping, determining which fan interpretations deserved legitimacy, while others remained unofficial. Scott positioned himself as arbiter of what counted as real FNAF fan content versus what stayed relegated to amateur status. This felt antithetical to the spirit of fan creativity, where anyone could participate regardless of official approval. The initiative created incentives for developers to sanitize their visions to match Scott's preferences, rather than pursuing bold creative directions that might be brilliant but incompatible with fanverse standards. It encouraged conformity over innovation, safety over risk-taking. Defenders argued gatekeeping was necessary. The Dormitabi situation showed what happened when the community embraced projects without standards. Disturbing content found audiences and legitimacy, until finally imploding due to creator misconduct. The fanverse prevented this by establishing clear quality and appropriateness bars, ensuring officially recognized content represented the franchise well. It rewarded developers who created excellent work while maintaining ethical standards and appropriate content. If that meant some creators were excluded because they couldn't or wouldn't meet those standards, that was acceptable cost of maintaining brand integrity. The commercial aspect complicated things further. Fanverse developers could sell their games, transforming hobby projects into potential careers. This created financial incentives that changed the entire dynamic. Developers weren't just creating for love of FNAF anymore, and they were competing for Scott's attention and approval with real money at stake. This made rejection more painful and acceptance more coveted. It also raised questions about whether developers kept rights to their creations, or if fanverse inclusion meant ceding some creative control to maintain official status. The legal and business arrangements remained private, but their existence changed fan game creation from pure passion project to potential professional opportunity with all the complications that involved. The fanverse's impact on broader fan game community was mixed. On one hand, it validated fan creation as legitimate, showing that quality fan work could achieve professional recognition. It inspired developers to pursue ambitious projects, knowing exceptional work might be rewarded. On the other hand, and it created divisions between anointed fanverse games and everything else, suggesting only certain types of fan content deserved celebration. Games that might have been community favorites got overshadowed by fanverse selections. Developers who couldn't or wouldn't conform to fanverse standards felt marginalized from the conversation about what represented good FNAF fan games. Looking at the Fanverse initiative several years after its launch, its legacy is complicated. It successfully elevated some brilliant fan projects to professional status. It established boundaries around appropriate content that filtered out problematic games. But it also showed the limitations of top-down curation in grassroots creative communities. Scott couldn't vet developers carefully enough to avoid misconduct scandals. He couldn't monitor Fanverse projects to ensure ongoing quality as development continued. He couldn't prevent the initiative from becoming entangled in controversies that tainted even well-made games by association with problematic creators. The Fanverse revealed that managing fan content at scale is nearly impossible. You can't quality control hundreds of projects manually. You can't investigate every developer's personal history thoroughly enough to catch concerning behavior. You can't establish objective standards that everyone agrees with about what content is appropriate. Attempting to do so creates systems that are simultaneously too restrictive, excluding legitimate creative expression, and too permissive, failing to catch serious problems until after damage is done. Maybe the only solution is accepting that fan communities will include problematic content and focusing on responding appropriately when issues arise, rather than preventing them through gatekeeping that can't actually work at the necessary scale. Community reckoning, self-policing and growth. The FNAF fan game community's journey from naive celebration of all creative expression to painful confrontation with its darkest corners forced a reckoning that extended beyond individual controversies or platform policies. By 2023 and 2024, after waves of creator misconduct, problematic content, and public implosions of promising projects, community members had to ask fundamental questions about collective responsibility, acceptable boundaries, and how to maintain the creative freedom that made fan games special while preventing the exploitation and harm that freedom had enabled. The answers that emerged weren't perfect, but they represented genuine attempts to learn from disasters and build something healthier. One of the most significant shifts was how the community discussed problematic content. In the early years, criticizing fan games' content choices was often dismissed as censorship or not understanding horror. But Dormitabis showed what happened when legitimate concerns about disturbing content got rationalized away. Community norms evolved to accept that while horror content was expected in FNAF games, there were still boundaries worth defending. Sexual violence against minors wasn't edgy horror. It was inappropriate regardless of creator intent. And graphic descriptions of child murder weren't atmospheric storytelling. They were exploitative shock content. The community learned to distinguish between horror that aimed to frighten and horror that dwelt on trauma and violence in ways that felt more like the creator working through disturbing fantasies than crafting engaging experiences. This shift enabled more nuanced conversations about content warnings and age appropriateness. Developers began including explicit content warnings for their projects, not because platforms required them, but because community expectations had changed. Warning players about intense horror elements, disturbing themes, or content that went beyond standard FNAF became standard practice among developers who wanted their work taken seriously, and these warnings weren't admissions of inappropriate content, but signals that developers understood their audience, respected players' boundaries, and wanted people to make informed choices about what they engaged with. The community also developed better language for discussing the difference between boundary-pushing horror and problematic content. Pushing boundaries meant exploring darker themes, creating genuinely unsettling experiences, or subverting expectations in creative ways. This was welcome, encouraged, celebrated when done well. Problematic content meant dwelling on sexual violence, fetishizing harm to minors, including disturbing material that had no purpose beyond shock value, or creating experiences that felt more like creators' therapy sessions than intentional horror design. Our learning to articulate this distinction helped separate legitimate creative choices from content that deserved criticism. YouTubers and content creators became more thoughtful about which fan games they featured. In the early days, any FNAF game with decent presentation could get coverage from popular channels seeking content. But after several major creators found themselves embarrassed by having promoted games whose developers later faced serious allegations, standards tightened. Channels started researching developers' histories before featuring their work. They asked questions about content appropriateness. They included disclaimers when covering controversial games. Some implemented policies of not covering projects from developers with known concerning behavior, and this created informal gatekeeping, where community visibility became contingent on maintaining decent reputations, which incentivized better behavior. Platform moderation evolved too, though slower than community norms. GameJolt implemented clearer content guidelines, specifically addressing FNAF fan games' common issues. Sexual content, even implied or suggestive, became explicitly prohibited. Extremely graphic violence or gore beyond standard horror game levels would result in removal. Games had to include accurate descriptions and content warnings. These changes couldn't prevent all problems, but gave moderators clearer standards to enforce and users clearer expectations about what they'd encounter. The days of anything goes fan game hosting were ending and replaced by a platform's understanding they had responsibilities to their users even when hosting amateur content. Community self-policing emerged as unexpectedly effective force. When developers released problematic content or behaved inappropriately, community members called it out immediately and forcefully. Comment sections, Reddit threads, and Discord servers became venues for collective response that pressured bad actors in ways platform moderation alone couldn't. Developers who might have ignored official warnings couldn't ignore thousands of community members explaining why their work or behavior was unacceptable. This created accountability through reputation damage that mattered more to creators seeking community recognition than official sanctions that just meant re-uploading elsewhere. The community also developed better support systems for young creators. Mentorship programs emerged where experienced developers helped newcomers learn game design, programming, and appropriate conduct. Discord servers dedicated to fan game development included explicit guidelines about behavior and content expectations, with moderation teams ready to intervene if things went wrong. These spaces created environments where young developers could learn the craft, while being socialized into community standards about what was acceptable, reducing the likelihood they'd make major mistakes out of ignorance or poor judgment. Female developers and other marginalized community members found ways to support each other against harassment. Networks emerged where women could share experiences, warn each other about problematic community members, and coordinate responses to harassment campaigns. These support systems couldn't eliminate harassment, but made it less isolating and provided resources for dealing with it. Male allies increasingly called out misogynistic behavior when they witnessed it, recognizing that allowing targeted harassment to go unchallenged perpetuated toxic environments that drove talented developers away. The community became more skeptical of celebrity culture around developers. The parasocial dynamics that enabled so much misconduct became recognized as problematic rather than cute or funny. Fans learned to appreciate developers' work without treating them as personal friends or heroes whose behavior must always be defended. This wasn't easy, since passionate fandoms naturally develop these dynamics, but awareness of the problem helped people recognize and resist it when they noticed themselves getting too invested in defending creators against legitimate criticism. Educational content about healthy community dynamics appeared. Video essays analyzed what went wrong with various FNAF fan game controversies, not just to rehash drama, but to help community members understand patterns and warning signs. Discussions about parasocial relationships, power dynamics between creators and young fans, and recognizing manipulation tactics became part of community discourse. This meta-level engagement with community health issues showed maturation beyond just making and playing games, to thinking seriously about the ecosystem those activities occurred within. The shift from purely reactive to somewhat proactive response made a difference, and instead of waiting for full-blown scandals before acting, community members learned to notice warning signs early. If a developer was cultivating uncomfortably close relationships with young fans, people noted it publicly. If content seemed to cross lines into inappropriate territory, it got called out before becoming a major controversy. If someone exhibited concerning behavior patterns, they faced pushback immediately, rather than being given chances to escalate until harm was done. This proactive approach couldn't prevent all problems, but caught some before they developed into disasters. However, these improvements came with growing pains. Some community members felt the pendulum swung too far toward caution and restriction. They worried that legitimate creative expression would be stifled because people were too quick to criticize anything edgy or unconventional. They pointed to false accusations or overreactions, where innocent creators face backlash over misunderstood context or bad faith interpretations of their work. Finding the balance between accountability and presumption of innocence, between establishing boundaries and maintaining creative freedom, remained an ongoing negotiation with no perfect resolution. The question of redemption and second chances also proved contentious. Should creators who made mistakes but learned from them be permanently exiled from the community? Or should people who acknowledge problems and change their behavior be allowed to participate again? And different community members had different answers based on the severity of original misconduct, sincerity of apologies, and whether the person had demonstrated actual change. These debates revealed disagreements about whether communities exist primarily to protect potential victims or to rehabilitate people who've caused harm, with no clear consensus emerging. Looking at the community's evolution from 2014 through 2025, the progress is undeniable but incomplete. The FNAF fan game community became more thoughtful about content appropriateness, more willing to hold creators accountable for misconduct, more proactive about establishing and maintaining standards. But it remained imperfect, still grappling with the same fundamental tensions between freedom and responsibility that sparked the initial controversies, and the difference was awareness. Community members understood these tensions now, talked about them explicitly, and tried to navigate them thoughtfully, rather than assuming everything would work out fine without conscious effort to maintain healthy community dynamics. This represents genuine growth, genuine learning from painful experiences. The community that created and celebrated Dormitabis wouldn't exist today. The permissive acceptance of any creative choice, the resistance to criticism as censorship, the naive assumption that art existed separate from artist's character, all of that eroded in the face of real harm caused by not having better standards. What replaced it wasn't perfect, but it was better, more thoughtful, more protective of vulnerable community members, more willing to have uncomfortable conversations about boundaries and accountability, more mature in the best sense, having learned through experience what idealism alone couldn't teach. Lessons learned. What the controversies taught us. The turbulent history of FNAF fan game controversies, from Five Nights in Anime's provocation, to Dormitabeast's horror, to FNAF Plus's public implosion, offers uncomfortable but valuable lessons about creative communities, online platforms, and human nature when passionate interests intersect with inadequate oversight. These lessons extend beyond FNAF specifically, applying to any situation where enthusiastic amateur creators produce content for young audiences with minimal gatekeeping. Understanding what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what factors enabled or prevented harm provides roadmap for healthier community dynamics in other contexts. The first and most fundamental lesson is that creative freedom without accountability isn't actually freedom. It's just chaos with better marketing. The early FNAF fan game community believed that allowing anyone to create anything without judgment or restrictions would produce flowering of creativity. Best ideas would naturally rise to prominence, while poor content would be ignored. This assumption proved devastatingly wrong. What actually happened was that disturbing content found audiences, problematic creators built followings, and the lack of standards enabled people with bad intentions to exploit community openness for harmful purposes. Freedom requires responsibility to be sustainable. Communities need agreed-upon boundaries, not to stifle expression, but to prevent the worst impulses from destroying what makes the community valuable. The second lesson is that platforms cannot rely purely on reactive moderation when hosting amateur content at scale. GameJolt and itch.io's approach of taking down content only after complaints proved inadequate for FNAF's explosive growth. By the time problematic games were reported and removed, they'd already been downloaded thousands of times, featured in YouTube videos, and become part of community conversation. Reactive moderation is closing the barn door after horses have stampeded through entire countryside. Platforms hosting user-generated content need more robust systems, better initial filtering, clearer and more specific guidelines, more moderators relative to content volume, and willingness to make unpopular decisions about restricting certain content types even when users complain about censorship. The third lesson concerns parasocial relationships between creators and fans, particularly when both are relatively young. Many FNAF fan game controversies involve developers in their late teens or early 20s, building devoted audiences of teenagers and preteens. The age gap wasn't large, but the power dynamic was significant. Developers had status, recognition, and platforms that young fans admired desperately. This dynamic enabled exploitation when developers were willing to abuse it, with vulnerable fans unable or unwilling to recognize inappropriate behavior from people they idolized. The evidence suggests communities need to actively resist celebrity culture around amateur creators, and emphasizing that making good games doesn't grant someone special status that overrides normal boundaries about appropriate behavior with young people. The fourth lesson is that content warnings and age restrictions are meaningless without enforcement mechanisms. Almost every problematic FNAF game had ratings or warnings saying it was for mature audiences. This changed nothing, because platforms had no way to verify ages or prevent younger users from accessing content meant for older audiences. Age gates that rely on users honestly reporting birth dates protect nobody. Real age verification would require measures most platforms aren't willing to implement: due to privacy concerns and usability costs. This means platforms hosting content for mixed-age audiences must default to standards appropriate for their youngest users, even if this disappoints older community members who want more mature content. The fifth lesson is that communities cannot simply dismiss early warning signs as overreaction or pearl clutching. Dormitabis's disturbing content was defended as just edgy horror choices until Blackout's real behavior came to light, at which point people realized the game's fixation on violence against children was perhaps more concerning than they'd wanted to acknowledge. But those concerns were raised earlier and dismissed by defenders claiming critics didn't understand horror or were being too sensitive. Learning to take seriously even uncomfortable criticism, to consider whether content that makes people uneasy might deserve that reaction rather than dismissing their concerns. It could prevent communities from celebrating deeply problematic work until catastrophic revelations force reckoning with what they'd been supporting. The sixth lesson involves understanding that harm isn't always direct or immediate. Five Nights in Anime didn't assault anyone, but it normalized sexualizing characters from a franchise popular with children, contributing to environments where sexualization of young people's interests became acceptable. This indirect harm is harder to measure than concrete misconduct, but it's real. Communities need to think beyond, did this specific thing directly hurt someone identifiable, to considering what norms and expectations their acceptance of certain content establishes. What message does the community send by celebrating versus criticizing various content types? What behaviors are implicitly condoned or condemned based on what gets supported versus rejected? The seventh lesson is that redemption and accountability must be balanced carefully. Some creators made genuine mistakes, learned from them, and deserved opportunities to rebuild trust. Others engaged in serious misconduct that should disqualify them permanently from community participation. But distinguishing between these categories is difficult, subjective, and contested. Communities need frameworks for evaluating whether someone's apologies and changed behavior warrant second chances, or whether certain lines, once crossed, represent permanent disqualification. Perfect answers don't exist, but having these conversations explicitly, rather than making case-by-case decisions based on whoever argues most persuasively, helps establish more consistent standards. The eighth lesson concerns brand management and intellectual property. Scott Cawthon's permissive approach to fan games enabled amazing creativity, but also created problems he couldn't directly address because he wasn't formally involved in fan projects until the Fazbear fanverse. This revealed tensions in fan content ecosystems. IP holders want to see their properties handled appropriately, but exercising too much control stifles the grassroots creativity that makes fan communities valuable. Finding balance between permissiveness that enables exploitation and gatekeeping that kills spontaneous creativity remains an unsolved problem, with the fanverse initiative's mixed results showing how difficult threading this needle actually is. The ninth lesson is that transparency about problems matters more than pretending everything is fine. Communities that refuse to acknowledge controversies, that sweep problems under rugs or pressure members to stay quiet about misconduct, enable cycles of abuse. The FNAF fan game community's willingness to eventually discuss its problems openly, even when painful and embarrassing, allowed for learning and growth that wouldn't have happened through denial. Yes, being known for controversies damaged the community's reputation, but that damage was already done, whether acknowledged or not, and only through honest examination could patterns be identified and prevented from recurring. The 10th and perhaps most important lesson is that passionate communities need to resist the assumption that everyone within them shares their values and good intentions. Early FNAF fan game community assumed that people creating and playing fan games were fundamentally decent, that shared interest in FNAF meant shared ethical standards. This assumption allowed bad actors to operate freely because community members couldn't imagine that people who seem to share their passion might have disturbing ulterior motives. Healthy skepticism isn't cynicism. It's recognition that communities centered on children's entertainment will attract people whose interest in children isn't innocent. That fame and recognition will attract people who want to exploit those for personal benefit, and that creative freedom will attract people who want to express genuinely harmful ideas. Protecting communities requires acknowledging these realities, rather than pretending everyone's motivations are pure. These lessons come at significant cost. Real people, especially young community members, were harmed by the failures these lessons emerged from. Talented developers saw their passions and livelihoods destroyed by association with controversies. Platforms faced difficult decisions about how to moderate content at scales they weren't prepared for. And the FNAF community lost innocence, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how quickly enthusiasm for a horror game franchise could create environments enabling serious harm. But refusing to learn from these experiences, pretending the costs weren't worth the lessons, ads would compound the harm by allowing patterns to repeat in other communities, other contexts, other groups of passionate people creating content without understanding the responsibilities that came with their platforms and influence. Conclusion. Moving forward from the shadows. As we reach the end of this exploration through the darkest corners of FNAF fan game history, what remains is complicated. On one hand, the community showed remarkable creativity, producing thousands of games that expanded Scott Cawthon's vision in directions he never imagined. Talented developers honed skills that launched professional careers. Young programmers learned game design through projects they cared deeply about. The FNAF fan game ecosystem represented the best of internet culture. Passionate people collaborating, iterating, and celebrating shared interests without corporate oversight or commercial pressure. These positive aspects remain real and valuable, achievements worth celebrating even as we acknowledge the darker elements that existed alongside them. But on the other hand, this same ecosystem enabled serious harm. Young people encountered disturbing content they weren't emotionally prepared for because age restrictions existed only in theory. Developers with troubling behaviors used their status to exploit vulnerable fans. Projects that should have been rejected by community standards were defended and celebrated until catastrophic revelations forced reckoning. Platform moderation proved inadequate for content volumes nobody anticipated, and the community's default assumption that criticism of creative choices represented censorship allowed problematic content to flourish long after it should have been rejected. These negative aspects are also real, failures that caused genuine damage even as the community produced remarkable creative work. The fan games we've examined in detail, Five Nights in Anime, FNAF+, and especially Dormitabis, represent different points along the spectrum of controversy. Five Nights in Anime was inappropriate rather than harmful, poor judgment rather than malicious. FNAF Plus's cancellation stemmed from creator misconduct during development rather than game content itself. But Dormitabis represented something darker, a project whose disturbing content presaged its creator's real-world behavior, a game that should never have existed, and that the community should have rejected earlier based on content alone, rather than waiting for allegations against Blackout to provide justification for condemnation it already deserved. Understanding why these games gain traction requires acknowledging what they offered audiences. Five Nights in Anime found people who wanted sexualized versions of FNAF characters, a niche that existed whether the community approved or not. FNAF Plus promised a definitive remake of Scott's original vision before being derailed by controversy. Dormitabis attracted players drawn to its promised darkness and edge. People who wanted FNAF content that went beyond Scott's restraint. These audiences were real, their desires genuine even if the content created to satisfy them was problematic. And what remains unclear is whether these creators fully understood they were tapping into these desires, or whether they simply made content that happened to resonate with audiences they hadn't anticipated. The community's recovery from these controversies shows both progress and ongoing challenges. Standards improved. Moderation became more robust. Community members grew more willing to call out problematic content and behavior. But the fundamental tensions remain unresolved. How do you maintain creative freedom while preventing exploitation? How do you protect vulnerable community members without becoming so restrictive that creativity dies? How do you distinguish between content that makes people uncomfortable because it's effective horror versus content that makes people uncomfortable because it's inappropriate? These questions have no perfect answers, only ongoing negotiations as communities evolve and circumstances change. What we can say definitively is that pretending these controversies never happened, refusing to discuss them because they're embarrassing or uncomfortable, would be worse than acknowledging the community's troubled history. Other fan communities face similar dynamics. Other franchises beloved by young people will generate amateur content that occasionally crosses lines. Other platforms will struggle with moderating user-generated content at scale. The FNAF fan game community's painful experiences offer lessons that could prevent other communities from making the same mistakes, but only if people are willing to learn from them, rather than dismissing them as unique to FNAF's particular circumstances. For current and future fan game developers, the message should be clear. Creative freedom comes with responsibilities. You're creating content that real people, often young people, will engage with. The power to create carries obligation to consider impact. Technical skill doesn't excuse inappropriate content. Popularity doesn't shield you from accountability for misconduct. And the permissive environments that allowed earlier problematic projects no longer exist, having been replaced by communities and platforms that learned from experience to establish better standards. If you want to create fan games, do so thoughtfully, ethically, with awareness that your work doesn't exist in a vacuum, but contributes to broader community culture. For platforms hosting fan content, the lesson is that reactive moderation fails at scale. You need clear, specific guidelines. You need enforcement mechanisms beyond hoping users report problems. You need to accept that some good content will be excluded by standards that prevent harm, and that this trade-off is worthwhile. You need to resist pressure to allow anything and everything in the name of creative freedom, because that freedom, without guardrails, inevitably gets exploited by people with harmful intentions. For community members, the message is about vigilance without paranoia, skepticism without cynicism. Not everyone creating fan content has pure motivations. Some warning signs deserve attention, even if calling them out feels uncomfortable. Defending creators you admire is natural, but not when their defense requires dismissing legitimate concerns from people they've harmed. And recognizing that your favorite projects might be problematic doesn't require abandoning them completely, just engaging with nuance about their strengths and flaws, what they got right and what they got wrong. As the FNAF franchise continues evolving, with new official games and ongoing fan creation, the shadow of these controversies will continue informing community dynamics. Developers who lived through the Dormitabi situation or watched FNAF Plus implode learned lessons they'll carry forward. New creators entering the community will hear cautionary tales about what happens when things go wrong. Platforms will maintain standards developed through trial and error and litigation anxiety. And the games themselves, the ones that cause these controversies, will remain part of FNAF history, even as the community wishes they didn't. Five Nights in Anime exists in various archives, preserved for anyone curious about controversial FNAF fan content. FNAF Plus lives on in trailers and pre-release footage. Reminder of what might have been if creator misconduct hadn't destroyed a promising project. And Dormitabis, despite being removed from official channels, remained accessible through various means to anyone determined to find it, carrying with it the weight of everything we now know about its creator and content. These games can't be unmade. Their impact can't be erased, but they can serve as warnings, as cautionary tales about the importance of boundaries, accountability, and community standards in creative ecosystems built around content that attracts young audiences. The FNAF fan game you never knew existed, the one that shouldn't have existed, isn't a single game but a category, a type of project that emerges when creative freedom lacks appropriate oversight, when passionate communities prize acceptance over accountability, when platforms prioritize growth over safety. These projects will exist in any fan community that reaches sufficient size and cultural prominence. The question isn't whether they'll appear, but how communities respond when they do, whether lessons get learned, or whether each new community repeats the same mistakes because they didn't pay attention to what happened elsewhere. Tonight, we've drifted through the shadows of FNAF fan game history, examining projects and controversies the community would prefer to forget, but must remember if it wants to avoid repeating. These cautionary tales matter precisely because they're uncomfortable, because they reveal how quickly enthusiasm can curdle into exploitation, how easily good intentions can enable harm when not tempered by thoughtfulness and care. If even one person creating fan content, moderating a platform, or participating in a creative community thinks twice about their responsibilities after hearing these stories, then discussing them served a purpose beyond morbid fascination with gaming controversies. The FNAF community survived its darkest chapters. It learned, evolved, and established better standards. But the work of maintaining healthy community dynamics never ends. Each new generation of creators and fans must learn these lessons anew, must resist the temptation to dismiss them as outdated concerns or overreactions to isolated incidents, because they're neither. They're patterns that recur whenever conditions allow, whenever vigilance lapses, whenever communities forget why certain boundaries exist and what happens when they're ignored. Before we close, if you've made it this far through this examination of controversial FNAF history, consider sharing your thoughts. Did you know about these controversies already? Are there other problematic fan games we didn't cover that you think deserve discussion? What lessons from FNAF's experiences might apply to other fan communities you're part of? And most importantly, what do you think communities should do differently to prevent similar problems while maintaining the creative freedom that makes fan content valuable? Like and subscribe if you appreciate this kind of deep dive into uncomfortable gaming history that most would rather ignore. These stories deserve to be told. These lessons deserve to be learned. And these mistakes deserve to be acknowledged so we can collectively do better moving forward. Because that's ultimately what examining these dark chapters is about. Not dwelling in misery or celebrating controversy, but learning from failure so future creative communities can avoid making the same mistakes, can establish better norms from the start, can protect their most vulnerable members while supporting genuine creativity. The FNAF fan games that shouldn't have existed taught us more than many successful projects. They showed us the importance of boundaries, the necessity of accountability, the dangers of parasocial relationships between creators and young fans, and the reality that passionate communities require conscious effort to maintain healthy dynamics. These aren't lessons anyone wanted to learn this way, but since the community paid the cost through real harm to real people, the least we can do is extract value from that cost by ensuring others don't have to repeat the same painful process of discovery. Thank you for joining me on this uncomfortable journey through FNAF's darkest creative corners. May the lessons learned in these shadows help build brighter, safer, more thoughtful communities for future generations of creators and the fans.